Sweden's decision to acquire the Leopard 2A8 is not simply a procurement story about tanks. It is a reflection of a deeper shift in how Stockholm now understands war, deterrence, and its own responsibilities after joining NATO. For decades, Sweden's defense policy rested on the assumption that geography, diplomacy, and a credible but restrained military posture would be sufficient to deter aggression. That assumption has been fundamentally revised. The Leopard 2A8 must therefore be read as a strategic statement, not a technical upgrade. The security environment surrounding Sweden has changed more rapidly in the last few years than at any point since the end of the Cold War. Russia's war in Ukraine shattered the long-held belief that large-scale conventional warfare in Europe was a historical anomaly. For Swedish planners, the lesson was not abstract. It was concrete and operational. Territorial defense against a capable state adversary remains relevant, and it remains decisive. In that context, the decision to invest in a heavy main battle tank signals that Sweden is preparing for scenarios that go well beyond limited crises or symbolic deterrence. At first glance, the choice of a heavy armored platform may appear counterintuitive in an era dominated by drones, precision missiles, and cyber warfare. Yet this is precisely why the Leopard 2A8 matters. Sweden is not betting against new technologies. It is betting that future conflicts will combine them with classic elements of high-intensity land warfare. The battlefield in Ukraine has shown that armored forces, when integrated with air defense, infantry, electronic warfare, and artillery, remain indispensable for holding ground, counterattacking, and sustaining combat under fire. Sweden's decision reflects a sober reading of that reality. The Leopard 2A8 also represents continuity rather than rupture. Sweden has operated Leopard-based platforms for decades, adapting them to local conditions under the Stridsvagn 122 designation. The new variant builds on that experience while expanding it. What changes is not the existence of armored forces, but their role. Previously, Swedish tanks were optimized primarily for national territorial defense, operating largely within a national framework. The Leopard 2A8 moves Sweden decisively into a NATO-integrated concept of operations, where interoperability, shared logistics, and common standards are central. This shift has geographic implications. Sweden's strategic depth is limited, but its geographic position is pivotal. The Baltic Sea, the island of Gotland, and the southern approaches to the Nordic region are no longer peripheral spaces. They are central to NATO's deterrence posture. A modern heavy armored force gives Sweden the ability not only to defend its own territory, but to act as a stabilizing anchor within a wider regional framework. In practical terms, this means the Leopard 2A8 is as much about reassuring allies as it is about deterring potential adversaries. Public debate in Sweden reflects this complexity. There is broad support for strengthening national defense, especially since NATO membership has reframed security as a shared responsibility rather than a purely national choice. At the same time, Swedish society remains deeply committed to welfare, social cohesion, and fiscal responsibility. The cost of the Leopard 2A8 program has therefore become part of a wider discussion about priorities in peacetime. This debate is not a weakness. It is characteristic of a mature democracy that insists on scrutinizing strategic choices, even when the security environment is deteriorating. Importantly, criticism has not focused primarily on the tank itself, but on the scale and timing of defense spending. Some voices question whether heavy armor is the most efficient investment compared to air defense, cyber capabilities, or resilience of civilian infrastructure. Others argue that the very uncertainty of the future makes diversified investment essential, including armored forces. What unites these perspectives is an underlying recognition that security can no longer be taken for granted. The Leopard 2A8 has thus become a symbol of a broader reckoning with risk. From a NATO perspective, Sweden's choice carries clear signaling value. As a new member, Sweden is demonstrating that it intends to be a net contributor to collective defense rather than a passive beneficiary. Heavy armor is one of the most demanding and costly capabilities to maintain. By committing to it, Sweden signals seriousness and credibility. This matters not only militarily, but politically. It strengthens Sweden's voice inside the alliance and reinforces trust among partners who are themselves making difficult investment decisions. At the same time, it would be a mistake to interpret the Leopard 2A8 as a step toward militarism. Sweden's strategic culture remains fundamentally defensive. The emphasis is on deterrence through preparedness, not power projection for its own sake. The logic is straightforward. A country that is clearly capable of defending itself and contributing to Allied defense is less likely to be tested. In this sense, the Leopard 2A8 is intended to reduce the likelihood of war, not to normalize it. Looking toward the next decade, the Leopard 2A8 fits into a longer-term vision of Swedish defense. It complements investments in air power, naval forces, and civil defense. It also aligns Sweden more closely with its Nordic neighbors, particularly Finland, which has long emphasized robust land forces. Together, these choices suggest a regional convergence toward a realistic, threat-informed defense posture grounded in lessons learned rather than assumptions inherited from a more stable era. Beyond immediate deterrence, the Leopard 2A8 also raises a deeper question about sustainability and societal resilience. Modern armored forces are not only expensive to acquire, but costly to train, maintain, and integrate over decades. By committing to this path, Sweden is implicitly accepting a long-term responsibility to preserve military competence, industrial support, and political consensus across multiple election cycles. This represents a meaningful departure from the earlier assumption that major defense investments could always be postponed or scaled down during periods of relative calm. For Swedish society, this implies a subtle but important shift in mindset. Security is no longer treated as a background condition guaranteed by geography, international norms, or past behavior. Instead, it becomes a continuous policy choice that must be renewed, explained, and justified to the public. In this sense, the Leopard 2A8 is not only a weapon system, but a catalyst for a more sustained national conversation about risk, preparedness, and responsibility in an uncertain Europe. Ultimately, the question Sweden is answering with the Leopard 2A8 is not what kind of tank it wants, but what kind of peace it seeks. A peace based on optimism alone has proven fragile on the European continent. Sweden's response is to anchor its security in capability, integration, and credibility. The Leopard 2A8 is one expression of that choice. It does not mean Sweden expects war, but it does mean Sweden refuses to be unprepared for it, and accepts the long-term obligations that such preparedness entails.